Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I hope my voice is coming over clearly. Yes, everything's all right. Wonderful. It's great to have you here. And well, for a year or so, I'm scavenging in the territory of paleoanthropology and human evolution, thanks to this class I inherited from Jacques Morin, which is here, and I'm very happy about that, and especially about his guidance and this great portfolio of information, and especially the Carta Symposium talks, which are immensely beneficial here for teaching and research purposes. Talk about the deep history of interfering with the environment. Interesting enough, there was a talk here that's given a few weeks ago by one of the most eminent entomologists, not an anthropologist, but an entomologist, Mark Moffat, who's dealing with ants a lot. And interesting observation here about measuring the Anthropocene, which is very much in focus and very much in the spotlight at the moment, that human nations are not alone in their capacity for global conquest and environmental destruction. Certain ants with huge societies are doing the very same thing right now. A fascinating talk on ants and the Anthropocene, and also the measurable and tangible damage they do interfering with the environment. However, we as humans have a particularly bad reputation here for not only meddling but messing with the environmental equilibrium, with the environmental balance, and especially since the strong Anthropocene is very much in focus here for the past decades. There's lots of information, there's lots of heated and controversial discussion here about to what degree we already damaged the balance and the equilibrium of the environment of our planet, and whether we still have the intellectual ability, not only the intellectual capacity, but also the willingness to counteract this. Well, it's very negative perceptions here eventually that the end is nigh and it will be bloody. It's probably a horror movie poster, sorry. But well, probably we should not be too pessimistic about it. We will see. Now, we see what makes us special here, and what distinguishes us from other beings on this planet, including ants. And when we look into the deep history of bipedalism, we're ending up, this is one of the most recent charts that I can present you. There are other charts where there's even more subspecies distinguished here, but I think this is a very workable chart. And we are now here, this was just added here in the past 1.5 decades or so with the Ardipithecus ramidus and Cadava and the Sahelanthropus and Aurorin tugenensis, early bipeds. And so this whole story extends now well beyond 6 million, 7 million years. So the better accomplished reconstructions or visualizations of these bipedal beings, they stress one important point, and actually this is something that also the anthropologists eventually agree on, that wherever we look here, also with the famous Australopithecus here, the Brazil and the more robust ones here with Lucy, so-called Lucy, Dicknash as one of the most famous protagonists here, or this dead ant in the braided stream of evolution, the Paranthropus, with his excessively huge molars here. Well, they are rendered for good reason as something that we don't associate ourselves too much with. So, and also the anthropologists confirm that we should rather call them animals. They behave like animals, they act like animals, they react like animals. And this continues here well into the phase when these bipeds now gradually lose their body fur, got flatter faces and a facial, especially a facial physiognomy, which is more akin to what we are looking at ourselves when we're looking at the mirror. So these early protagonists of species Homo, let it be Rolfensis or habilis. And here, of course, we have the big game changer, the Homo erectus, which managed to survive on this planet for almost 2 million years. So this is something we still have to accomplish. We are here for about 330,000 years, so there's still a way to go. And we will see whether we manage as a species to be as successful as erectus, with the earliest examples going back to about 2 million years, and the latest ones here from Indonesia, the island of Java, dated to around 115,000 before present. So it's almost a 2 million year span of having roamed this planet. And of course, Homo erectus here has to be credited, or is very well known for having been the first biped that left Africa and radiated to other regions here on this planet, much later on also including very different environmental zones like Eurasia and especially Pleistocene Europe. But the first route or the first migration, the first radiation here out of Africa, shortly after 2 million years before present, led the Homo erectus here to Indonesia, to especially here also the island of Java. And the reason for why this is the first place out of Africa where this particular species migrated, or the region that was colonized, is that the climate and the environment was not only akin, but actually identical to the African environment. So like animals, again, this group looked for places to thrive, to exist, that resembled very much their own environment. The reason why this was possible at all is that at least around 2 million years before present, the results of mitochondrial DNA analysis shows us that this is the time when the species or the bipeds lost most of their body hair and replaced this with sweat glands. This is our great advantage. Of course, we can walk and run very, very long distances without overheating, because we can balance, we can regulate our body temperature through sweating. This is not possible for other furry beings, and this is one of our great advantages, of course. But still, in terms of behavioral patterns, this is nothing that is too close to what we later on became here in this braided stream of evolution. Now, at the very end, currently, we have these two famous fellows, Homo neanderthalensis and what we supposed to be Homo sapiens, here at currently the upper part of this braided stream. And well, Neanderthalensis is pretty much in the spotlight. It was since the 19th century for sure, but since we know how close we actually are, with a bit tongue-in-cheek approach, I called him our brother from another mother. Since we know how close we are, there's also the question to what degree Neanderthals displayed behavioral patterns which are similar, which are akin to anatomically modern or archaic and then also modern Homo sapiens. There was lots of exchange going on here, genetically spoken, with a Neanderthal intake, which measures still 3 to, I think, maximum 5%. So anyone living here in Europe, Eurasia, and also parts of the Middle and Far East still carries a little bit of Neanderthal around. That's the result of recurrent interactions, recurrent interbreedings here with Neanderthals, which started here shortly after 100,000 years before present, and this recurrently happened, and still we are carrying this genetical marker in us. Now, to come back to the initial question that we're asking here, in terms of the deep history of interfering with the environment, there's a very recent article that was just published by Sabine Gaudinsky-Windhäuser, an old colleague of mine from Mainz, and her peers, about landscape modification by last interglacial Neanderthals. And here they identify, as it is stated here, a distinct ecological footprint in hominin activities. So the question is whether also Neanderthals already profoundly interfered or profoundly altered the environment. So we should now look a little bit into the question how similar we are and how similar we eventually behave, comparing modern sapiens and Neanderthal here. Well, the Neanderthals, this is an archaic human which evolved from a more ancient ancestor exclusively in Europe and Eurasia and the Near East. The eponymous find spot here close to modern Düsseldorf in Germany, the Neanderthal caves, where the first fossil fragments were excavated, were found, not really excavated, but found here in the 19th century. And now one important issue that is subject to recurrent debate for several decades is the fact that Neanderthals buried not everyone of their tribe, but members or certain individuals here that were interred in a more or less conscious and regular way. There's plenty of examples here also from the Near East, from Kebara, Amud, but also from Europe, of course, La Ferracie. And well, these individuals, they look pretty disturbed here. There's a reason for that. Many of these burial compounds were disturbed by cave bears very shortly after the interment. But the phenomenon is there. They do bury certain members here, certain individuals of their bands. And there's, of course, the famous Shanida Burial, which is in the spotlight since the 1960s, 1970s. The famous Flower Burial, as it was nicknamed, which is now debunked. So it seemed like this Neanderthal burial was carried out in terms of that flowers were put here on top of the interment, which is a very, in inverted commas, human approach and human behavior. This seems to be now debunked, that these flowers were the result of a pollen intake or seed intake by a little rodent, which is typical here for this region in northern Iraq, and that was just coincidental, but the phenomenon remains. They buried their next of kin. However, there are other issues which are a bit more disturbing here in that case, which is the amount of injuries and recurrent injuries and healed injuries that were observed and are observed on Neanderthal skeletons. Sure enough, life was not very convenient and easy here for any bipedal species in these ages. But for the Neanderthals, it's a bit excessive in terms of injury. So there's lots of different ideas of what caused these injuries, whether these Neanderthals pursued an extremely risky hunting strategy, the so-called rodeo rider hypothesis has to be mentioned here. I just show you two examples from the Shanida cave here, from a broken and mended rib and a broken ankle. Now, this is possible to correlate for sure. So modern rodeo riders suffer from very much the same or similar injuries than Neanderthal individuals. So there's the idea that they engaged in these very risky strategies. That might be a spurious correlation. Spurious correlations are a beautiful thing. I show you a few examples here very, very quickly. You can correlate US spending on science, space, and technology with suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation here. This correlates quite beautifully. You can also correlate The age of Mesoamerica with murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. People are still killed like that for whatever reason. And my most favorite one is the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool correlates with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. You see that this has to be handled with some care, but there are other realities which are way more disturbing. In terms of how these Neanderthals acted and interacted and reacted here with each other, eventually also with Homo sapiens. It's supposed that they had generally a very low population with a low genetic diversity. There's a very disturbing case from the El Cidrón cave in modern Spain, where we have here 70 we have individuals here, 13 individuals with only on the fossil material, on the bones, with 17 different congenital anomalies as a result of interbreeding. And at the end, they ate each other. So there's evidence for cannibalism, and eventually some specialists here use this as a model to explain the demographic collapse of Neanderthal populations after 35,000 BP in Europe and Eurasia and anywhere else. So that's not necessarily only us and our behavior that triggered the extinction, but they technically interbred and ate each other into extinction, which is not a nice idea, but I think I have my final 5 minutes here. Am I right? All right, here we go. So, okay, let's leave that here aside for a minute and look at how similar or different they eventually were, again, compared to us. Is there something like artistic expression? A key question here, which I cannot dwell here too long because of time constraints, but whatever I show you here, this is all contested. So this might be Neanderthals who did it. That might be also modern humans, and especially this bone flute here from Dij de Babe in Slovenia is also questioned and contested. So this might be Neanderthals, but the possibility is rather low. The industry, the stoneworking industry of Neanderthals is, and this is not my idea, but the idea of anyone working in the field of lithics in the Paleolithic, is very conservative. It doesn't change very much. There are regional differences, but there's very little that really shows some kind of creative quantum jump here. They're doing basically the same stuff. They're doing very nice, and they're teaching this also to others. But it's very conservative, to say the least. And if one compares this with artifacts from anatomically early Homo sapiens, we have a much greater variety. And this is now my essential point I want to touch on, which is that our mind is wired in a different way. There's a greater variety of items. They are treated in a very different way. And there's lots of jewelry around. We'll see that again in a minute. We have here currently the earliest evidence for anatomically modern Homo sapiens, or archaic Homo sapiens, but here the immediate predecessor of us, from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, with a still stretched or elongated skull, but the facial physiognomy is perfectly coinciding how we look nowadays. And this coincides with something that I always call the creative quantum jump. So we have now jewelry. We have many different materials on the record. We have shells, we have bone jewelry and alike from a variety of places here from Africa. This is currently, I think, the earliest collection, dated to about 150,000 before present, again from Morocco. We have them from the south of Africa, from the Blombos cave. We have decorated ochre pieces. We have now bone frequently here in the record. We have jewelry, and this is of course something also from Turkey here, from the Üç Ağızlı cave. And this is something that we can relate to this idea of symbolic behavior, which is nice because we communicate ideas in a very different way than other more archaic bipeds. This is here the lack of symbolic behavior. You enter a territory of another group, you're killed. or you kill the others. That's done by chimpanzees, for example. And whenever there's symbolic behavior, this is great because you can communicate feelings and ideas in a different way. This has many different dimensions and expressions, and we know this currently only from, in that quantity, from Homo sapiens. Cave paintings, we have little figurines, we have the so-called Venus figurines, which serve probably a very different purpose than the name implies, but it's a very different story. But then there's this, and this is something that is exclusive to us, and this is probably part of the problem, dear listeners. We imagine things and represent them. We're making things up in our head and render them. This might be a shaman. This might be a creature which was imagined by someone and rendered here on this cave. We saw also these beautiful examples in the morning talk by one student, I think, from Bilkent University, from the Trois Frères cave in France. Here, a kind of mask worn by a human, most probably from England, and here the Lion Man. We already saw a picture of it today. Such things do not exist in reality. They're imagined, and they're wired here in our brain and represented in that way. And this is probably part of the issue. When we see the dispersal of anatomically modern humans, we see them in places which are hardly habitable for our species, for bipeds, but they're there. And probably it's this little god in our head, which tells us to do this and to that, and that we approach things in a very different manner. Just as a final example here, a very well-known quote from the Bible, which tells us to subdue the earth and rule over the fish and the sea. And this, I think, distinguishes us from other species in a very positive sense, but probably also in a very negative manner, that we can do much more damage to our environment because we are approaching it in a very different manner. Thank you very much for your attention.